Hi team, welcome to Health Stats IQ. It's a video series dedicated to the critical concepts within health statistics. And if you want to see any of these videos, I'll put a link in the description to the playlist for all the Health Stats IQ vids, or else you can check out my website on zstatistics.com. But we're having a look at relative risk and odds ratio today, so we'll jump straight into that, shall we? Let's do it. So we're first going to look at the intuition behind these two concepts. And I'm going to use an example to show you how to calculate relative risks and odds ratios. We'll then look at case control studies, and that's where odds ratios really come into their own. After that, I'm going to see if I can make an equivalence between relative risks and odds ratios. And I'm going to provide you this really interesting chart that shows what particular relative risk values equate to in odds ratios. That's something I've not seen before in other videos on YouTube, so you might want to stick around for that. And finally, we'll look at some examples from research so you know what you're looking for when you're doing a bit of research of your own. So let's jump into the intuition now. Relative risk, which I'm terming RR, and don't forget this may also be risk ratio. Some people call this risk ratio, but I'm using relative risk, which I believe is a bit more common. Relative risk and odds ratio are measures of group comparison used when we have a categorical exposure and a categorical outcome. Okay, so typical exposures we might look at in health sciences might be something like an intervention group versus a control group. So this is a categorical exposure because you're either in the intervention group, so you've been given the medicine of interest that we're testing, or you're in the control group where you're given the placebo or not given any medicine at all, for example. Other types of categorical exposures might be when we look at, say, male versus female, or we might even turn something numerical into a categorical exposure, such as looking at BMI, body mass index. We might say there are two categories of body mass index. If you're over 30 BMI, that means you have the exposure of interest in that you are overweight. And if you're under 30 BMI, that means you're underweight. More generally, we might also say that someone has the morbidity versus someone doesn't have a particular morbidity. So whether that's diabetes or a particular cancer or something like that. So these are all types of categorical exposures, and the categorical outcomes we tend to be interested in are a lot simpler. They're either looking at whether someone died or survived, or alternatively, we might have a categorical outcome, which is that they developed the disease versus not developing the disease. So relative risks and odds ratios help us when we're trying to compare the probability of a negative outcome between the two exposure groups. So let's take one of these and have a look at an example. We're going to take the BMI over 30 and under 30 exposure, and we're also going to look at the categorical outcome, which is the development of a disease. And in this case, the disease of interest is whether someone has a stroke or not. You can see we have the exposed group being those who are obese in that their BMI is above 30. And those unexposed are those who are, well, healthy is an interesting way of putting it, just not being obese, but we'll just call it healthy to make it easy. Less than 30 BMI is unexposed. And of course, there are two potential outcomes, stroke and no stroke. So let's put some numbers in here. Let's just say we had 100 people in our sample that were obese and 500 people that were healthy. And you can see the numbers of strokes for each of those particular exposure groups. Now, the first thing we might want to do is actually calculate risks. So before we can get a relative risk, we actually have to get the individual risks of each of the exposure groups. So let's have a look at the obese group first. The risk of a stroke for obese people in this sample is 20 on 100, which is 0.2. So you take the number of people who have had a stroke in that group, divided by the total number of people in the group, and you get 0.2. Pretty straightforward. Whereas the risk for healthy people, you can see we've only had 50 strokes out of 500. So that's a risk of 0.1 or 10%. Now, there are formula for this, but I tend not to use formula on this channel when it's something that's very intuitive, because I think it turns your brain off. And I want your brains very much operational right now, so I'm not going to feed you formula. He says, showing a formula, although this one's just to show you that the relative risk is going to be the risk of the exposed group, which is going to be the obese, divided by the risk of the healthy group. So we get a relative risk of 2. So the way we can interpret this relative risk is to say that obese people have twice the risk of developing stroke when compared to healthy people. And this all makes a lot of sense. And I think it's quite intuitive, the idea of a risk and then a relative risk. So let's go to the dark side now and have a look at odds ratios. So whereas the risks were the number of people in the stroke outcome group divided by the total, the odds are actually the people in the stroke outcome group divided by the people in the no stroke outcome group. So instead of being 20 on 100, it's actually going to be 20 on 80. That's for the obese group. And the odds of experiencing stroke for the healthy group is not 50 on 500, but it's 50 on 450. So we actually get different numbers when we're calculating these odds. They're different to the risks. And once we calculate these, the odds ratio is calculated very much like the relative risk was, where we just take the top one divided by the bottom one. And in this case, we're going to get 2.25. So for the same data set, we're going to get a different odds ratio than we will relative risk. And if we were to interpret this odds ratio, we'd say that obese people, or the people in the exposed group, have 2.25 times the odds of stroke when compared to the healthy group. Now this will raise a really important question. And here it is. What on earth did we need odds for? It seems like we had everything we wanted with relative risks. Why do we need to create something which is less interpretable, harder to actually visualize, and provides an extra layer of complexity on things? Well, in the particular example here, there is no real reason to calculate odds ratios. And while I haven't really mentioned it, this particular example is what might be called a prospective study. The idea being we kind of follow a bunch of obese and healthy people along, and we follow them up to see whether they have the outcome or don't have the outcome. And because it's prospective, these individual rows are consistent. So we have 100 obese people in our sample and 20 of them had a stroke. We had 500 healthy people in our sample and 50 of them had a stroke. These are all internally consistent. But what if we don't have a prospective study? What if we have a case control study? Well, let's find out. And you might be guessing that this is where odds ratios are actually necessary. So if you haven't heard of case control studies before, this is where I'll introduce them to you as well. And they're very common. This is a question that can be answered by a case control study. Does inner city living increase the risk of lung cancer? Okay, so let's have a think about the exposure again. We've got the city dwelling. So if you live in the city, you might think that you get exposed to more car fumes, less natural environments and stuff. So perhaps you're going to experience a larger probability of lung cancer. So if we're going to do a prospective study here, we need to find a lot of people in both these dwellings, follow them up and see if they develop lung cancer or not. The problem here is we're going to need a lot of people in both of these exposure groups because realistically, lung cancer is pretty rare. So we realistically have to follow, let's just say 10,000 people in each of these groups just to get a decent amount of data with which to work. So if we did this, we could totally find relative risks and that would be fine. But of course, the reality is that's a very large study that we need to conduct. Very expensive. It's going to take a long time because it's prospective, don't forget. We have to follow them up many years later because lung cancer is something that develops over many, many years. So this is realistically not doable. What happens is we actually sample from a bunch of people that have lung cancer and then also a bunch of people that don't have lung cancer. Usually these people are matched or they're kind of very similar people to those in the lung cancer group, but on all facets except for the fact that they have no lung cancer. And in this way, we're actually selecting cases. These are called cases, those that have lung cancer, and those that don't have lung cancer are called controls. Now, you don't actually have to sample the same number of cases and controls. That tends not to happen exactly. But let's just say in this case, we've sampled 200 people with lung cancer and 200 people that have no lung cancer. We then can survey them to say, well, where have you lived most of your life? In inner city areas or in regional areas? So let's just say that these are the numbers that we get from our sample. Okay, so here are the 6 kind of calculations that we made on the previous slide. We found the individual risks and the risk ratio. Then we found the individual odds and the odds ratio. Reg here just means regional dwelling. City is for city dwelling. My question is, which of these calculations can you actually find from the data we've been given? And the answer is only the odds ratio. We can't calculate any of these other measures with the data we've been given. Why not? Why can't we calculate risks? Well, think of it this way. So we've selected 200 cases and 200 controls. We didn't really need to select 200 and 200. We could have selected anything we wanted in each of these 2 groups. And that would obviously change the calculation we'd make for the risk. If we were to try to calculate a risk for the city dwelling, we'd go 145 divided by the total. But what does the total even mean? It's totally dependent on how many cases versus controls that we've just chosen to sample. If you tried to calculate it, it would look like it's more than 50% of people getting lung cancer. So clearly, we can't calculate risks. Risk ratios similarly won't make any sense for the same reasons. And the idea of calculating the odds for a city dwelling is equally as silly, because again, it looks like we're going to have more people developing lung cancer than not developing lung cancer in the city. You'd have 145 divided by 122. That's crazy. So clearly we can't have any of these calculations. Why then can we still nonetheless calculate an odds ratio? Now this is where I am going to give you a little bit of formula action. For the first time on this channel, I'll put some formula up here because I think in this case it is actually useful. So on the previous slide, we found that the odds ratio, if the cells here are represented by A, B, C, D, the odds ratio was A on B, that'd be the odds for the exposed group, divided by C on D, which is the odds for the regional group. Now, it doesn't take much maths to realize that it's actually the same as saying A on C divided by B on D. So what you might think? Well, the good thing about having A on C is that it is entirely internally consistent. We've selected 200 people that have lung cancer. So we know that of those that have lung cancer, 145 of them live in the city. So 145 divided by 55 is an internally consistent ratio that tells us the odds of living in the city if we have lung cancer. So if we're to calculate the odds ratio, we can go 145. Now, I've actually done it this sort of vertical way, but you could have done it the original way we looked at the odds ratio by going 145 divided by 122 and then dividing all of that by 55 on 78. But I've done it kind of the other way. It'll get the same answer by going 145 on 55 divided by 122 on 78, and I get 1.686. So there we have the reason for odds ratios. So even though you'd never use an odds ratio when you had a relative risk available, in case control studies, that's all you got. So here we can say that city dwellers have 1.686 times the odds of developing lung cancer when compared to regional dwellers. And as we're going to find out, for rare diseases like lung cancer, the odds ratio is actually going to be very, very close to the relative risk anyway. So this 1.686 we can almost take as a relative risk, even though this is not a prospective study. But that only works when cases are rare. Let's investigate that a little bit more. So let's have a look now at the equivalence chart that I talked about at the start of this video. Before we look at the chart, I just want to show you 2 particular scenarios. In this first table up here, you can see we have 1 case in the unexposed group and 2 cases in the exposed group. So in other words, 1% of the unexposed group become cases. 2% of the exposed group become cases. So the relative risk would be 2. It's just 2% divided by 1%. Similarly, down here, you can see we have 40% of the exposed group become cases versus 20. So again, the relative risk is going to be 2. 40 on 100 divided by 20 on 100. In each case, the exposed group has twice the risk of becoming a case, in other words, developing the disease or dying, for example, than the unexposed group does. So I've written here that the risk for the unexposed group is 0.01 on this first example, and the risk for the unexposed group is 0.2, 20% for this example. If you were to calculate the odds ratio for each of these two examples here, you'd find that you get 2.02 in this top example and 2.67 in the bottom example. Feel free to check these calculations, by the way. It's probably a good test, if you like. But you can see that the odds ratio is actually quite close to the relative risk when we have rare diseases. In other words, when cases are rare. But when cases are not so rare, the odds ratio will differ by a lot from the relative risk. So what I've got here is a way of equating the relative risk with odds ratio. And I'm starting with this blue line here, which is where our unexposed risk is 1%. So when it's a very rare disease, you can see that as the relative risk increases to 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, all the way up to 5, the odds ratio kind of mimics it. And by a relative risk of 5, the odds ratio is only slightly higher than 5. So that dotted line represents where the relative risk is equal to the odds ratio. So this basically shows you that when you have a rare disease, the relative risk that you calculate will be very similar to the odds ratio. You can see what happens though when we have a slightly more common disease, or when the cases are slightly more frequent, the odds ratio actually starts increasing quite a bit above the relative risk. So it's still quite close when you've got relative risks of say 1.5 and 2, but let's add now a 10% risk in the unexposed group. And you can see what's going to happen. We've got 10%, 15%, there's 20%, 30%, and even 50%. So if the risk in the unexposed group was 50%, your odds ratio is going to be a lot higher than the relative risk that you create. I thought this was useful to see because when I was studying this, I was like, well, what are the differences in terms of magnitude of relative risks and odds ratios? And hopefully this chart can give you that kind of impression. When the overall risk of developing the disease is low, they're very similar. But when the overall risk increases, your odds ratio is going to be a lot larger than your relative risk. So the final thing we're going to have a look at in this video is an example from research looking at relative risks and an example from research looking at odds ratios. So the first one comes from Curhan in 2019. And I'll put the link in the description of the video if you want to check out the actual study. So what Curhan did was look at the effect of hearing loss on cognitive decline in old patients. So the idea being that if you have more hearing loss, you're actually more likely to have a higher degree of cognitive decline. So they created categories of hearing loss and also categories of cognitive decline for which to make this comparison. Now, because this was a prospective study where we followed up people that had hearing loss to see whether they developed cognitive decline, well, guess what? Then we can use relative risks. So let's have a look and see the table that they had in this paper. So here we have table 3, which looks at the hearing status of the person. So this shows us which exposure group each of the people are in. So no difficulty hearing is the unexposed group. Mild hearing loss is the sort of, I guess, first stage of exposure. Moderate hearing loss is a higher exposure group. Severe hearing loss with no hearing aid is a higher exposure group still. And then there's another exposure group being severe hearing loss using a hearing aid. You can see we have the number of cases here showing us the number of people that developed cognitive decline. And we have the age-adjusted relative risks. So forget about the age adjustments for the moment. What this is showing us is the risks of developing cognitive decline compared with the reference category of no difficulty. So in brackets here, this says ref in this first one because this is our reference category. 1.28 in this particular category for mild hearing loss means that if you have mild hearing loss, you have 1.28 times the risk of cognitive decline of someone that has no hearing loss. So your risks are increased essentially by 28% if you have mild hearing loss. If you have moderate hearing loss, your risks are increased by 34%, or in other words, you have 1.34 times the risk of someone in the reference category. And if you're in the severe group, you have 1.44 times the risk of cognitive decline of someone in the reference category. Now, for the record, all we're doing when we age adjust things or when we adjust things for other variables as well is just making sure that people in each of these exposure groups, the mild hearing loss group, the moderate hearing loss group, and the severe hearing loss group, are actually similar on a whole bunch of other variables. It's possible that people with severe hearing loss might have other comorbidities that are creating their cognitive decline. So when we adjust for those other comorbidities, that's when we get these different relative risks. But anyway, I thought I'd show you an example of where relative risks are used in practice. Now, Wrench does a study just from the year 2020, comparing the experiences of COVID with different ethnicities. So what Wrench does is that they look at Black, white, and Hispanic people using their ethnicity as the exposure of interest, and then seeing how that might affect the outcome of developing COVID, but then also of dying from COVID as well. So they do a lot here. But the key point to note is that it's a case control study. They select people that have COVID, and then they select people that do not have COVID. So they're actually looking at the cases and controls and going backwards to then assess their ethnicities and potentially their ethnicities and other factors as well. So let's have a look at that particular paper. So here's what is called a forest plot. So I'm showing you a lot in this video, but what this is showing us is the odds ratio where we compare different ethnicities in terms of a positive test result for COVID. So when we compare white to white, obviously the odds ratio is going to be 1. We need a reference category, which in this case is going to be white people. So Black people have 1.93 times the odds of testing positive for COVID than white people do. Hispanic people have 1.84 times the odds of testing positive for COVID that white people do. And again, they actually compare different age groups as well. For some reason, they've chosen 60 to 69 as the reference group. So you can see that as you get younger, you're actually more likely to test positive for COVID. But interestingly, if we look on the right side here, you've got the 30-day mortality among cases. Clearly, as if you're younger, you're going to have a lower odds of dying from COVID. And so that's what this right side looks at. Here it shows us that there's not much difference in terms of the actual mortality between white, Black, and Hispanic people. There is a difference between those in various age brackets. And interestingly, it looks like while male people have much more positive test results, they also, in fact, look like they have slightly higher mortality as well. So their odds of dying from COVID is 1.48 times that of females. But you can see these are OR, odds ratios. Why? Because it's a case control study. We've collected data from those that have COVID, and we've compared them to those people that do not have COVID. Or in this case, we've looked at people who have died from COVID and compared that to people who have not died from COVID. So that's it, guys. It was a big video, but we were looking at relative risk and odds ratio. I thought I would try to make it extensive. If you liked that, please subscribe to the channel. And if you know anyone that is into health sciences, share these videos around, because I think it's going to become quite a nice little extensive look at health statistics, which will help clinicians, hopefully epidemiologists, and some budding statisticians themselves, I would think. Anyway, my name's been Justin Zaltzer. I hope you've enjoyed. You can check out all the videos from this series and others on zstatistics.com. I'll catch you around.